Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. I am Hindal Jada, student at Virginia Commonwealth University, majoring in art history. I am so pleased and honored to have the chance to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Dana Sajdi. She is a professor of Middle Eastern history at Boston College and specializes in history, societies, and cultures of the pre-modern Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, Egypt, and Turkey. Her research has focused on the production of texts by unusual authors from the region. Her current project, Visualizing Damascus, is about textual production in the city of Damascus. She is the author of several books, including The Barber of Damascus, Nouveau Literacy in the 18th Century Ottoman Levant, and the editor of Ottoman Tulips, Ottoman Coffee, Leisure, and Lifestyle in the 18th Century of 2008. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dana Sajdi, and her talk is entitled Chained Orality, Authority, and History. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila and Jonathan, for inviting me, and thank you, Marissa, for being very accommodating to me when things were tough. And I guess also thank you, VCU and VCU Qatar. It's lovely to be feted so nicely. I'm having a severe class anxiety. I feel like I'm above my station, especially with such luminaries. Is it, I tend to be loud on stage. Is it too loud? No. Okay. The image that you see in this is an audition certificate. It was given this is an audition certificate that usually is given by an author to someone who has heard his work. And so this is an attestation that one person heard the book of the other and is then given the license to transmit it. And this particular one happened to be by the great scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, and is given to some Mamluk Emir. But anyway, the point of this is the attestation in writing of an oral process that is predicated upon a text. And so that's going to be the crux of my talk. Shihab ad-Din Ahmad ibn Budayr was a practicing barber in 18th century Damascus. He owned a barber shop in Bab al-Barid, a stone's throw away from the Umayyad mosque, inside the city walls. Surprisingly, this barber, whose father, uncle, and all of his cousins worked as porters, wrote a book. And this is the one image of the unique manuscript from 18th century, and is now at the Chester Beatty Library. And this was sent to me by a German colleague, where he found the ex libris of the barber in his own hand on one of the manuscripts in Berlin. So the book is a contemporary chronicle that is a record of events that took place in his city during his lifetime and covers the years 1741 to 1762. Chronicle writing, especially in Syria, is historically associated with the ulama, the scholarly elite, who are the religious and moral guardians of the Islamic social order. So how does a barber, whose social and occupational background was presumably far away from the world of the scholarly and the literate, managed to write a book of his own? The answers to this are quite complicated and lie in both the social and literary levels. Here, I will not deal with the complex socioeconomic and political circumstances that allowed the barber and others like him to garner the confidence to become authors. I will tackle the question from the literary perspective by reviewing the history of Arabic historiography. Indeed. More specifically, I will explore the genre of the chronicle at its moment of canonization in the 9th and 10th centuries, and proceed to its development in Syria to show how, over the centuries, the scholarly form metamorphosed in such a way as to become capacious enough to include the voice of the barber. In doing this, I will emphasize how a particular kind of orality, which was a necessary scholarly practice, was not only constituted authority in history, but also determined and defined historical genres. It was only when this kind of orality was not required as a scholarly practice that the barber and a host of other voices entered the text of history. In the end, I will argue that the 18th century scribal contemporary chronicle, as authored by the Barber and the other new authors, functioned like a preprint newspaper and ushered the brave new world of the Arab Renaissance, al-Nahda. Needless to say that such a long history can only be done in broad strokes, and that the story is meant to be suggestive and not authoritative by any means. One of the most interesting elements in Ibn Budayr's book is his use of the tarjama, or the obituary notice. This is an old literary form in which an author relays the death of someone, typically a scholar, offering biographical details that include the deceased's accomplishments, official positions, education, his teachers and students, the books he authored, and the books he was authorized to transmit. It's a sort of narrative CV that follows a particular literary formula. Surprisingly, Ibn Budayr, the Barber, offers many tarjamas of scholars and also mystics. So an example is, on Friday the 20th of Muharram, our Shaykh, our teacher, the scholar of his time, unique in his age, Muhammad ibn al-Ghazi, the Mufti of the Shafi'is passed away. I read jurisprudence with him. We have not beheld any expression more pleasurable than his, or meaning sweeter than in his speech. And whatever poetry was uttered in his presence, he would be able to finish the verse and respond with more eloquent and better poetry, unquote. For a scholar to be the subject of a tarjama is not problematic, since scholars were the customary authors and inhabitants of that space. However, Ibn Budayr flouts the rules not only by authoring tarjamas, but also by including the most unusual subjects in his obituaries, like the illiterate storyteller of oral popular epics. And I quote, "Our father, mentor, and instructor, Sulaiman bin Hashish al-Hakawi, died. May God have mercy upon him. He augmented his age and time and was singular in the arts of his time. He related the epics of al-Dhahir, Sayf, and Samar and Antar in Arabic and Turkish. He had a prodigious memory and sound knowledge of every art, for all that he was illiterate and could not read and write. This is the highest degree of eloquence among mankind. Indeed, he was a bottomless ocean. May God have mercy on him," unquote. I have juxtaposed these two specific tarjamas because they raise the problem of the traditional division between the popular and the scholarly, and between orality and literacy. The subject of the first obituary, Al-Ghazi, is a scholar par excellence. His work had to do with the written word, and as such, he was a product of chirographic culture, or the culture of writing. The epic storyteller, on the other hand, is incapable of delivering words in their written form. Despite being bilingual, he was illiterate. His contribution, limited to words as sound, belonged to what is called primary orality. According to Walter Ong, the epic is the hallmark of primary oral cultures, in which writing was absent or near absent. Built out of boxes of narrative episodes, the epic depends on formulaic images, repetition and redundancy and rhyme, all of which facilitate the mnemonic processes, that is the process which render memorization easier. Because it's not predicated upon a written text, it's additive, situational, and participatory. Essentially, it's a performance with a present, not imagined audience. Most significantly for us, the epic is incapable of chronology. The linearity of time is only achieved in the mode of the chirographic. The movement from the primary orality to the chirographic, according to Ong, renders communication of knowledge a different cognitive process. Exteriorized out of the body and away from sound and memory, the written text is capable of linearity and neat emplotment, and allows for precision and the analytical process. In other words, the chirographic necessarily allows the existence of the scholarly. All of the characteristics of primary orality enumerated by Ong apply to the repertoire of epics recited by the storyteller as reported by the Barber. All of the characteristics of the chirographic domain are not only represented in the works and culture of the other persons that Ibn Budayr eulogized, the scholar Ibn al-Ghazi, but also apply to the very genre in which the Barber himself wrote, the chronicle. As denoted by its name derived from the Greek chronos, the word for time, the chronicle's essential feature is the linear passage of time. If the Barber's inclusion of the tarjama of the scholar is justified or expected because of the chirographic and scholarly nature of the genre itself, if the Barber's inclusion of the tarjama of the scholar is justified or expected because the chirographic and scholarly nature of the genre in itself anticipates such subjects, the inclusion of the storyteller in this specific chronicle that is authored by a Barber is not entirely dissonant. It is perhaps due to the Barber's close familiarity with the storyteller, the latter's techniques have seeped into the Barber's text. While Ibn Budayr's chronicle is a wholehearted attempt at the production of a scholarly text, not least for its inclusion of the literary form of the tarjama, the elements of the oral epic permeate the book. The Barber's insistent use of rhymed prose, which is the typical register of the epic, even for the narration of the most mundane and insignificant events, adds a dramatic pitch. The overall narrative of the chronicle is a story of survival against the depredations of time and oppression of rulers, wherein the commoners, or in Ibn Budayr's speech, al-a'wam, are rendered epically heroic. In other words, the redeployment of the scholarly genre by Ibn Budayr is not only limited to substance by recording protagonists who are historically had not occupied textual space, such as the illiterate storyteller, but also extends to form. The chronicle is infected by sound and the popular oral. Ibn Budayr's text then represents a combination of literacy and primary orality. But Ibn Budayr's clever collapsing of the division between the oral and the textual, the popular and the scholarly, is not as subversive as it might at first appear. After all, the barber shop was a sibling institution to the coffee house, and we have evidence that the same activities that took place in the latter may have also taken place in the former. See this well-known image. Again, I'm an interloper here. I'm not an art historian, so I'm sorry if I'm dabbling with images not as I should be. So here is an image of a coffee house where you see people socializing, drinking coffee. There's a dancer here. There's a musician. But notice, here is one book. Here is another book. And I think there's a third one that I can't see right now. And of course, in a coffee house, you might also expect to see a shadow theater performance or actually an oral popular epic being recited. What are these books being read out? Are these books of poetry? Maybe, and maybe not, as poetry is usually in the purview of memory. Is this storytelling? Well, maybe and maybe not, because stories, again, are in the purview of memory. These may have contained texts just like that of Ibn Budayr, a chronicle relaying the news of the town. In the pre-print age, written public news appeared in chronicles. Otherwise, news traveled by word of mouth, in private letters, or through an official public crier. The genre of the contemporary chronicle, inasmuch as it was concerned with current events, was the form that came closest to our daily newspaper. To this issue of pre-print journalism, I will return at the end of the talk. For now, I want to use the image displayed to demonstrate that the textual could be found in place or in the places of the oral. This kind of oral communication is what Walter Ong called secondary orality. After the onset of the chirographic, oral communication continues to be necessary for knowledge transmission, but it is an orality that is predicated upon the text, upon the fact of the written text, and the analytical and sequential thought implied therein. So generally speaking, this secondary orality is no big deal. What is a big deal for my purposes is not the public recitation of texts per se, but the orality around and inside the scholarly text. This is the famous image of the illustrated maqamat. The scene is set in the primary locus of the chirographic. In the privacy of a walled library, a group of turbaned ulama are engaged in convivial banter, as indicated by some hand gestures. It is this type of secondary orality, which I will call scholarly textual orality, that was most constitutive of Islamic scholarship and elite scholarly culture. Indeed, it is the very social practice that defined historical authority itself. In the next section, I will show how this scholarly textual orality worked, but for now, let me say that Ibn Buday's accomplishment was not so much that he infused the textual with the oral, but rather that he managed to master scholarly social practices such as banter around books, which practice he demonstrated through his use of tarjama. I hope the significance of this will become apparent as I proceed, but for now, let me show how scholarly textual orality determined historical scholarship. I will begin at the beginning, in the late 9th and in the 10th centuries. The Barber's chronicles history is intertwined with the two main genres of Islamic historiography: the classic chronicle as canonized by the Tarikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk of al-Tabari, and the biographical dictionary as canonized by the Kitab al-Tabaqat al-Kabir of Ibn Sa'd. Typically, the chronicle is a record of exclusively past events, usually related to the matters of state and arranged chronologically around the Hijri year, while the biographical dictionary is a collection of terjamas, life stories usually of deceased scholars describing their qualifications and accomplishments. Despite their different intentions, it is well known that the relationship between the chronicle and the biographical dictionary was organic. According to some modern scholars, the evolution of both these genres, chronicle and biography, are intimately related to the rise of hadith. Before I draw out the connections between the genres and hadith, I would like to familiarize the audience with hadith as a literary event. I'm sure that many of you know this. As most of you know, hadith is a body of historical reports about the actions, deeds, and speech of the Prophet Muhammad. A hadith is made up of a report or a text, a matan, and that is necessarily connected to a chain of transmissions, Isnad. So a hadith report proceeds as follows. I heard from Zayd, who heard from Amr, who heard from Abu Zayd, that the Prophet did or said such a thing. The first thing to note is the emphasis on the oral transmission of the reports. Indeed, hadith transmission in the earlier days was entirely and authentically oral, but it occurred within a chirographic culture. That is to say, this was a secondary orality where writing had already taken hold. That said, it took some time before those who advocated the writing down of hadith per se to win the battle. The second issue to note is that the accuracy of the report itself depended on the integrity of transmitters. Those who wanted to ascertain the veracity of the text developed a methodology whereby they ascertained that the successive transmitters actually overlapped in time and that they were known for their accurate transmission. So the basic form of the historical report in a chronicle similarly consisted of the same structure of a chain of transmitters and the text. A chronicle was a collection of reports, each of which supported by a chain of transmitters. In our case, it's Jane and Jenny. Going back to the person who witnessed the event being reported, in our case, Sharon reporting on Amy's stolen pumpkin, which event had taken place before the lifetime of the author, in this case, I. So the job of a chronicler was not to authorize his own knowledge and make it public, but rather to compile, collect, and arrange authoritative reports. In short, the historian was not an author as such, but a transmitter. Indeed, al-Tabari is known to have related historical reports that contained contradictory historical information. However, for him, as long as the chain of transmission were sound, the text, even if they were of differing import, carried equal validity. So like in hadith methodology, it was held that the veracity of the text and accuracy of its content depended on the integrity of the transmitters. In order to establish the integrity of the narrators in the chain of transmission, something had to be known about them: their birth and death dates, their qualifications, etc. And of course, their reputation as transmitters. With the result that the other genre of historical writing, the biographical dictionary, came into being. Thus, the tarjama emerged as a written textual form demanded by the fact of the necessity of orality in the constitution of authority. As such, biography reinforced the continuity of historical authority as a practice in secondary orality. In the so-called classical period, then, the historian could not establish himself as an author without committing himself in writing to the yoke of an isnad of oral authorities. In the middle period, roughly between the 11th and 15th centuries, the chronicle underwent many significant transformations, the reasons for which I have no time or actually probably cannot treat. But here are the transformations. First of all, with the passage of time, the chain of transmission grew so long as to be too unwieldy to carry around, and their presence ceased to be formally required. So the history report started to appear without an Isnad. Secondly, historians continued to write universal histories, but history ceased to be an endeavor exclusively about the past. According to one modern scholar, every chronicler in Egypt and the Levant between the mid-13th and mid-15th centuries recorded contemporary events, and that no less than 17 out of 41 chroniclers concerned themselves exclusively with contemporary and very recent history. This then is the period when the contemporary chronicle, like that of Ibn Budayr, becomes a legitimate subgenre. And a visually powerful demonstration is this graph that shows the years covered by Mamluk Egyptian and Syrian chroniclers. And you see that even those who go all the way to the past, they stop just before a few years before they die, and many of them just concerned with themselves with recent history. Consequently, the historian now derived his authority not only from previous transmitters, but from the fact of his being a witness of events. One of the first historians to do this in the early 12th century is Imad al-Din al-Katib, who declares, in the late 12th century actually, who declares, "My testimony is based on entirely what I witnessed, and I have been concerned to record only what I myself have experienced." So the historian emerges fully as an author exhibiting a strong narrative eye. Thirdly, that's the third transformation, biography, the stuff of biographical dictionary, and event, the stuff of chronicles, hitherto separate categories become united between the two covers of a single book. In the beginning, they are treated as separate sections, but later they merge into the same page, and the tarjama is included as an event in the chronology. In other words, the chronicles of the middle period, especially the later one, looked a lot like our Barber's chronicle. But this similarity is more apparent than real, as will become clear a bit later. To return to the chronicles of the middle period, despite their new tendency to absorb the biography, biographical dictionaries continue to be written as a separate genre and are produced with unprecedented abundance. So now that the history text is unshackled from the Isnad and the historian is freed from the burden of past events, does this mean that historical authority is reconstituted? Does this mean that any literate witness of events could author a chronicle? The short answer is no. In order to impart legitimate historical knowledge, the burden of demonstrable authority remained. In order to legitimate himself as a historian, an author still had to demonstrate by academic training and professional reputation his possession of a pedigree of authorities. While the author-historian no longer had to provide a written documentary evidence of his credentials inside his text through an isnad, indeed he no longer needed the footnotes, so to speak. His certificates were to be found outside of his text, either as independent certificates, like the one that we saw at the beginning of the talk, or through the scholar's intellectual genealogy and performance of scholarly secondary orality with teachers and colleagues as found in his own biography or in those of his colleagues, teachers, and associates. As Michael Chamberlain has shown in his study of Mamluk biographical dictionaries, the continued necessity of the oral transmission of scholarly knowledge is evidenced through the biography's emphatic focus on social contact between scholars across generations and within the same generation. This socializing between scholars on the one hand and between scholars and their teachers and students on the other is expressed in a collegial language of friendship, suhba, companionship, mulazama, and affection, mahabba. In other words, it was not the companionship of books that provided authority. Rather, it was the social contact around books, the recitation of these books and the conversations about them with teachers and colleagues that gave one the credentials to transmit an author. This oral sociability is what limited and defined authority of all of Islamic knowledge, including in the field of history. Though doubtlessly enlarged, the scholarly social space continued to be limited despite or perhaps because of the establishment of public educational institutions as of the 11th century. Konrad Hirschler has recently shown how the middle period was characterized by the education of children, by increased participation of regular people, including artisan and craftsmen, in sessions of scholarly book recitations, and by the textualization of the products of primary orality, such as the popular epics mentioned by the Barber in his obituary of the storyteller. It is perhaps because of this general opening and democratization of knowledge that the scholars defined, protected, perpetuated, and recreated themselves through the insistent production of biographical dictionary. While the social backgrounds of Egyptian chroniclers became relatively and marginally more varied, and the language of Egyptian chronicles became increasingly colloquial, Syrian history writing remained a decidedly scholarly activity. Syrian proclivity towards scholarly authorship of history was emphasized some time ago by Li Guo in his study of the chronicles of Mamluk Egypt and Syria. Levantine history writing occurred among a group of associates who had remarkably similar backgrounds and who had common intellectual genealogies. Significantly, most of them were professors of hadith at Hanbali institutions, and most of them were attached to or related their intellectual genealogy to the great scholar Ibn Taymiyyah. In short, theirs was a relatively close scholarly network. The cohesion of this network is represented by the fact that many, but not all, of the chronicles that were written in the middle period, while written apparently as free, stand-alone books, were in reality supplementary histories. They were termed dhayls, literally tales, that is, sequels to chronicles written by previous authorities. For example, the 12th century scholar Ibn al-Jawzi's chronicle witnessed at least 4 supplementary chronicles into the 15th century by al-Katib al-Isfahani, al-Yunini, Abu Shama, Ibn al-Hijji. I have several other examples, but I need to skip for time. This, even while not transmitting from earlier scholars, the contemporary historian still acknowledged the authority of his predecessors by formally positing himself as no more than the tail end of their project. Though the ulama as historian had liberated themselves from the burden of history by writing about the present and unshackled themselves from the yoke of speaking on previous authority by disposing of the Isnad, more often than not, the contemporary chronicler still needed to attach himself to the ulama of the past. The phenomenon of supplementary history reflects an attempt at a continued monopoly by the ulama over history, which they seem to have considered a collective sequential project. One of the most important contemporary chronicles ever written in Damascus is that of Shams ad-Din ibn Tulun in the 16th century. Ibn Tulun, like previous Levantine historians, was a scholar. He too wrote his book as a sequel to a history authored by his teacher Abd al-Qadir al-Nu'aymi. Significantly, he titled his work مفاكهة الخلان في حوادث الزمان, bantering with friends about the events of time. This title reflects exactly the social practice of Syrian historians. To write history is to talk with fellow scholars, who together were engaged in a collective project of filling out time. And while they no longer needed isnads inside their history texts, they continued to chain themselves together through sequential and supplemental history and through biographies of friendship, companionship, and convivial banter. It was secondary orality that still informed their authority. Ibn Tulun's chronicle was one of the last supplementary histories written in the Levant. Very few dhayls were written after the 16th century. The demise of the dhayl phenomenon signifies that the writing of history had ceased to be an exclusive group project. Talking to God became very fashionable in the 17th century. Sufism, the ultimate personal experience that was of such overwhelming social significance throughout the Ottoman world, contributed to the impulse to write about the self. As shown by Jamal Kafadar and Derin Terzioglu and a couple other German scholars, mystically inflected first-person narratives, whether travelogues, diaries, or dream logbooks, became the order of the day. The participants in these genres came from different social backgrounds and even included one woman who authored a dream logbook. In Syria, the travelogues of the great scholar and Sufi saint Abd al-Ghani al-Nabulsi are a case in point. As for the contemporary chronicles of Syria, it became an ever more personalized genre. The late 17th and early 18th century chronicle of Ibn Kannan al-Dimashqi is tantamount to a published diary in which he reports political events and his own social life with equal vigor. While the ulama continued to author biographical dictionaries and remained engaged in their banter sessions, the 17th century seemed to have opened up the possibility for a direct line with God. People, regular people, in seeking closeness to the divine, saw that textual space was a legitimate container for their personal experience. The flip side of the coin of the opening of textual space is that the text itself acquired new authority. I previously alluded to the fact that the book by itself could not be a source of authority. For one to be authorized to transmit the contents of the book, she had to recite from it from memory to someone who had been authorized to transmit that book. In other words, the transmission of written authority is preceded and had to be predicated upon secondary orality. In his very recent book on intellectual life in the 17th and 18th centuries, Khalid al-Ruwayhib addressed significant changes in scholarly research and reading practices. He identified a phenomenon which he termed deep reading, a process through which scholars learn directly from books without the necessity for the oral communication with teachers and authorized transmitters. The 18th century scholar Abd al-Ghani al-Nabulsi, whom I've just mentioned, fervently defended the acquisition of authoritative knowledge solely through books. In his dream interpretation work, the same al-Nabulsi defined the meaning of a sighting of a book in a dream as simply power. This new attitude towards books may have allowed scholars a degree of disentanglement from one another, a disentanglement that was not necessarily social. They, of course, continued to hold their assemblies and symposia. Rather, they released themselves from the necessity of having to be orally and orally chained together, whether inside or outside the text. Secondary orality had ceased to be the sole constituent of authority. It is in this atmosphere of lucent authority around the book, as opposed to its concentration within it, and the legitimacy of personal experience in the written word, that the Barber wrote his chronicle. Additionally, by the time that the genre of the chronicle reached the 18th century, it had not only shed its Isnad, but also ceased to be a part of a sequential scholarly group project. It had metamorphosed in such a way as to become a genre singularly amenable to be appropriated by anyone, that is, anyone who could read and write. The genre, in other words, had become user-friendly. And indeed, the contemporary chronicle was thoroughly poached and appropriated. In Syria, in addition to the Barber, I have found 6 other non-scholars and relative nobodies who also authored contemporary chronicles. A couple of soldiers, a Greek Orthodox priest from Damascus, a judicial court clerk from Hims, a Samaritan clerk from Nablus, and a couple of agriculturalists from southern Lebanon. It is precisely because these various authors were ignorant of each other's work that I see the significance in this phenomenon of non-scholarly authorship of history. To my mind, such lack of awareness of the work of others and the simultaneous conversions of authors of such different social backgrounds on the text of the chronicle is indicative that the genre had become so familiar, so truly free for all, that anyone who was observant and literate could author a chronicle. When the Barber included terjamas of scholars in his chronicle, the custom seems to have ceased, at least in the chronicles as opposed to biographical dictionaries, which continued to be written. Given the changing atmosphere and social practices of scholarship, the terjama and its indication of necessary secondary orality should have no longer been a requirement. Perhaps unsure of his authority, the Barber may have employed it to ascertain his authority and credentials in the traditional style, that is, in the Middle Period style. Yet despite his desire to emulate what may have seemed to him a classical chronicle, the Barber's was no copycat of the scholars. His inclusion of an obituary notice for a storyteller reflects not only a Barber's indebtedness to the primary orality of the epic that permeated his text, but also a new and much more egalitarian attitude towards knowledge. It is the dawn of a new age. That's the title. The last Syrian chronicle known to have been written by a scholar was authored by the mentioned Ibn Kannan al-Dimashqi and goes up to the year 1741, which is the same year that the Barber started his chronicle. While there may have been other ulama authored chronicles that have been lost, I cannot but conjecture that the scholar may have exited the genre of the chronicle because by the 18th century it had ceased to facilitate and reinforce scholarly social practices. And precisely for the same reason, the genre allowed for the new voices of the barber, the soldiers, the Greek Orthodox priest, the court clerk, the agriculturist, and the Samaritan scribe to enter the genre. While each of these new authors had a unique focus grounded in his specific social reality, they were united in purpose in that they utilized the chronicle to assume a certain authority. Each took it upon himself to be the interrogator of and the guardian of his society and the moral compass of his community. This is a pre-egalitarian society where everyone is supposed to observe his station. But in the 18th century chronicle, we are no longer in the company of the scholar-historian performing his traditional duty of commanding the right and forbidding the wrong. Rather, we are listening to a motley crew. Consider how one of the soldier chroniclers exposes and ridicules the sycophancy of one of the most important Damascene scholars. How the barber blames the notables for lack of order and selfish self-enrichment and the oppression of the commoners. How the Orthodox priest chides Christian women for their impropriety. How the other soldier describes the rule of successive governors as tyrannical and murderous. How the agriculturalists of southern Lebanon make the most disparaging statements about the Ottoman states and its representatives. These new authors dared to admonish, issue judgment, and proclaim corrective measures. The new historian did so as a part of keeping record of current events. Under the guise of event, the chronicle of the new authors relentlessly located problems and offered diagnoses. The 18th century Syrian chronicle, in other words, read remarkably like a local community newspaper. It informed the public of current events of both political and social import and contained severe admonishments, gratuitous advice, and urgent pleas to both fellow citizens and the powers that be. The chronicle clearly served as an expression of public conscience or consciousness. Are these new non-scholar authors then preprint journalists? In Egypt and Syria, one of the most noted characteristics of the 19th century, a century of revival and reform dubbed al-Nahda, is the explosion of printed newspapers and journals on the scene, and the rise of the figure of the journalist, columnist, and publicist. While the printing press was introduced at the moment of a state-impelled modernizing reform in which new schools were established and European expertise had become a valued commodity, this exceptional, even passionate, and seemingly sudden involvement in print journalism cannot be attributed solely to state imposition or the encounter with the West. Though one does not deny the fact and effect of the importation of print technology and the significance of scientific missions to the West, or the seriousness of the intervention of a modernizing state, the transformation wrought by the al-Nahda would not have occurred without eager citizenry. There had been a social readiness or predisposition to plunge into the culture of print journalism and an open space for the new figure of the public intellectual to occupy. The wholehearted preoccupation with print journalism may be more readily explained through both continuities and ruptures, which continuities may have something to do with the phenomenon of the 18th century scribal chronicle written by non-scholars. Firstly, both the scribal contemporary chronicle and the print newspaper are reports of current events that also functioned as platforms for interrogation and reform. As mentioned earlier, before the adoption of print, the chronicle happened to be the only written and public form whose purpose was like the print newspaper, to inform. Secondly, authors of both newspapers and chronicles are civilian actors or random individuals. The breaking of the hegemony of the scholar as the sole author of current or even historical reports and his exclusive role as a commentator and judge was not an effect of Nahda, but a facilitator of it. The arrival of the new authors, well over a century before the Renaissance, had paved the path for the emergence of modern public intellectual. Thirdly, the generic resemblance between the chronicle and the newspaper, where genre is defined by time, must have rendered the transition from scribal to print method a process without much difficulty. Finally, even the reading or listening habits and the places where the scribal chronicle and the print newspaper were performed were the same. According to Ilham Khouri Maqdisi, who wrote a book about print journalism, or a chapter about print journalism, she said, the proliferation of the printing press and the exponential increase in textual production, specifically in the form of the periodical, did not, or at least not immediately, supersede older ways of writing and reading. Periodicals were often read communally. Articles were read aloud and discussed in coffee houses. In this new modern age, a different kind of secondary orality surrounds the quintessential Nahda sign, the typographical text of the newspaper. It is not an orality of scholarly bonding, but one that addresses and creates new citizens. This event occurs in a supposedly egalitarian world where the literate educator and the public intellectual are no longer necessarily of the ulama class. Curiously, after the 18th century scribal chronicles opened the door for the print journalist, no Barber ever wrote a history. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana, for a marvelous paper, a presentation. You know, I hardly thought this morning that we were going to cover 1,300 or 2,000 years or something like this, and go from my famous chicken scratching to print journalism and printing. You know, from laboriously carved stone inscriptions to newspapers that are turned out fast, from the permanence of stone to, from the permanence of stone to the ephemeral quality of the newspaper. And I think your point about how, you know, that we think of reading as a sort of personal activity, but the idea of taking something like a newspaper or a journal and reading it aloud to a group of people, I think is much more common also in the West than as in the Levant. So we've had quite a spin this morning. This afternoon, we're going to do some more geographical and technological changes. So I ask you all to come back at 2 o'clock. For the second session. Those of you who have registered for lunch, who've paid in advance, the lunch will be held in the central courtyard. Come out of the auditorium, turn right, and then turn left at the entrance lobby and walk through the double doors to the central courtyard. For those of you who have not paid for lunch and did not register and pay for lunch, there's a snack bar outside the auditorium, and it's serving lunch. And what else can I tell you? Oh, yes, the speakers are to gather at 1:30, the speakers of this morning's session at the Majlis room at 1:30 for a press meet and greet. So thank you very much. Once again, let us thank all our speakers of this morning for an extraordinary start.